So who are you and what do you do?
My name's Todd Rogers. I am a professor of public policy at Harvard in the School of Government, and I'm a behavioral scientist. What that means is I study how people make decisions and how to develop interventions to help people make better decisions.
Now, with all of that interesting work that you do, you decided to co-author a book called Writing for Busy Readers.
Yes. I think about interventions all the time, how we communicate things to people to help them, to make them more likely to vote, to increase attendance in schools, increase donation, reduce energy use, improve healthy behaviors, things like that. And Jessica Lasky-Fink, my co-author, and I were advising some state and local leaders during the pandemic and on how to communicate to busy constituents. And it became really clear that stage one of every intervention is communicating in a way that a busy person will understand what you're saying and not give up on what you're saying before you even get through.
Now, I'm guessing there's not a correlation between writing for a busy reader and the length, or is there?
Sure. That's one of the 6 principles. There are 6 principles of writing for busy readers. One is less is more.
So let's talk about why that is. We often hear things like we're getting shorter and shorter attention spans. People probably get somewhat nauseated with the goldfish analogy we hear a lot of. We think of ourselves as a TikTok nation or living in a nation of tweets or posts, I guess now that it's called X. But with that, we have people who will binge 40 hours of a TV show. We'll have people who will watch. Podcasting is a really interesting one where long form content used to be this show. It's about an hour. Now long form content is you have episodes that'll run 3, 4, 5 hours, and they are the number one shows. So what is the correlation between length and keeping people's attention? Because we could make the argument that people watch all of Game of Thrones in one binge.
Well, so we're talking about practical writing, things where you're trying to update people, get them to respond. You're trying to, so think about a report or a sales pitch or a disclosure or a text message to your family about Thanksgiving plans, any kind of written communication that is not recreation. And so we're not talking about New Yorker articles or poetry or leisure. We're talking about practical professional writing where, and we all do it. We're all writers. So it's a different kind of thing than the kind of like passive consumption of things that are entertaining. Here it is like we are writing for whatever. So you and I have emailed. That would be one mode of professional writing. And I know that my writing is dazzles, but I'm pretty sure that you were not that motivated to spend even half a second more than you had to reading what I wrote you before you responded.
Even if it's interesting?
I mean, you've got an infinite, I mean, honestly, here's like almost like a different name for the book could have been the helping, this is the word, a terrible name, or that's going to be too many words, but something about the infinite queue, right? Which is basically you have a queue of things you need to do that does not end and just nags at you, whispering in your ear when you spend 5 seconds looking out the window. And so you're looking at my communications or my report or my sales pitch, and just nagging is like, you've got to do a million other things. So one of the kinds of takeaways for us from the book is that people's goal when they read what we write is to move on as quickly as possible. And so we want to make it easy for them to do that.
Right. So what do we lose when we have a society like that can't take a beat, that can't take a breath, that can't focus on what you're sending because I'm in this infinite queue?
I've never used that phrase before. I like it. In the infinite
queue. It's your
queue.
Next article, Todd.
Totally. It sounds but I worry that it's going to turn into like a playlist, and like Spotify's new innovation is your infinite queue.
Right, yeah.
Which I'm using it as a disparaging thing. Like the problem is you have an infinite queue making you feel stressed, and Spotify is going to be like, well, we have created for
like
you
this.
for $29.95 your infinite queue. So what is lost in society? I'm so glad you asked that, because I actually anticipated, and Jessica and I talked about this, that this would be the single thing that we would be pushed on, which is, in a way, we are conceding and acquiescing to the fact that people are busy, distracted. It's their flood of information. It's cheaper to produce information. The switching costs are lower to go to something else. And so we're just like spending less time on everything, and we're submitting to it instead of holding up the righteous intellect of humanity. But I actually think that it goes a different way, which is that we've hardly gotten into the thesis, but the thesis is we want to write so it's easier for readers. And the easier we make it for readers, the more likely they are to read, the more likely they are to respond. And then the book is how to do that. The work is how to do that. And you could frame it as we're saying submit, but what we're saying is the world is as it is, readers are as they are, people are as they are. And we want to free your readers up to do the things that they find fulfilling and spend as little time as necessary dealing with the things that we send them that become just a time tax. We describe it, it's unkind to burden your readers with unnecessary stuff, even if they do read it. But the reality is, if you burden them with things that are too complex or too cumbersome to make sense of, they're often not even going to engage with it at all. And they're just going to move it off to tomorrow that never comes.
I think about these moments in time as it's because of X, Y, Z. We talked about TikTok. It could be text messaging. It could be that infinite queue that we're all dealing with, the overwhelming inbox, whatever it might be. And then I'm reflecting on the fact that the business partner I had in my digital marketing agency used to run a direct marketing agency prior to that. And he was very well known for this line, be brilliant, be brief, be gone, which is what he would say to his employees, which you probably wouldn't do as directly in this day and age, and also as a creative push to do this. Now, the interesting aspect of that is indirect marketing prior to the internet. It was all long-ish copy, or copy that would create action, not an image, not a TV spot, anything like that. And what they discovered is they would test things and get it to the point where even if they were editing, cutting, trying to be briefer, it wasn't changing the actual conversion rate. And the trick of the business was really in trying to define where that lies. Is it in words? Is it in, but at certain points, you realize there's nothing more you can do to increase the conversion or opportunity to get there. And I'm wondering if you reflect on that world before the internet, and how I think we've consistently said, look, if you're going to interrupt someone's time, be brilliant, be brief, be gone.
I don't know that we're in a different time than that. I've heard that as advice and counsel for people giving toasts. Be funny, be brief, be gone.
Right.
Or actually, maybe it was like, be funny.
I think you need another be there.
But there's also got to be something about kind and loving, right? Like
Okay,
be emotional, be funny, be gone. There it is.
Right.
I don't know that it's special to now. People are busy, and when they were reading their mailbox and they're flipping through things, they're looking and they're saying, is this relevant to me? And if I can't figure it out, it's probably in the trash. If I can figure it out, I'm going to skim it and then move on. So like I don't know that we're in a different time. What's different about now is that the production of communications is cheaper and easier, and AI makes that even easier. That means that we have more supply of it. The switching costs are lower, meaning instead of like literally to get to the next entirely new idea and possible Easter egg in my inbox, I just have to hit delete and go to the next thing, because I have no idea what great thing what dopamine hit I'm going to get from that. So the switching costs are lower. And possibly that all of that converges to mean that there's just more in your infinite queue. I don't know if you can have more of an infinite, but there's more.
It's interesting too, because this isn't a hunch that you and your co-author Jessica came to. This was based off of research and the work that you do. I'm curious about, when you write a book, we talk about cracking the spine. What's the thing that really got you to write the book? In research, I'm also wondering, what was that first question? What made you curious to follow this down a research rabbit hole? And then I'd love to know, what surprised you the most in the research, considering the fact that maybe we haven't changed all that much and this just is common sense type of thing?
What we've changed in is just in degree. Not right. There is more communication. There are more demands on our time, and the switching costs are lower than ever before. So the original research, and I'll get to the kinds of research that Jessica and I do, is we do randomized control trials, like pharmaceutical clinical trials. So we have a treatment group and a control group. And for me, I started doing political communications as experiments. So after grad school, I started a think tank in Washington called the Analyst Institute, where we translate behavioral science insights into political strategy on persuasion, fundraising, volunteer recruitment, get out the vote. But let's think about get out the vote. We're doing some kind of, and let's, for fun, call it text message or mail or email. Ultimately, stage one is, do they engage at all before moving on? And that was always the case. It's like, do they engage? And then conditional on engaging, well, what's the message? Do we emphasize this or that? Same with fundraising and same all those dimensions. Then I started doing parent engagement in school districts and started an organization. I came back to academia and did research on reducing absenteeism. And it turned out that if we mail dominates digital communications for reasons we could talk about if you're interested. But so I started an organization called Everyday Labs that now mails and texts something, 5 million communications a year for the largest urban districts in the country to reduce absenteeism. Again, do they engage or not? Like, it was always just sort of implicit in every intervention. You can't get to the psychology unless they're paying attention. And in the world, that's the first problem. Sort of like you were describing about your marketing communications. And so then it began with, then it just became really clear as we're working with state and local leaders, then they're communicating about COVID vaccines and restrictions and social distancing and whatever else, that like no one's reading anything. Like their first order concern was the first step, which is like, how do you get anyone's attention? It turns out that there's some principles to how you make it easier for skimmers.
Yeah. So that's the other interesting aspect, is this idea of skimming. Have we always been skimmers? Was skimming introduced by the very nature of newspapers? Has technology changed that? I remember the growth of things like Mashable, and you talk about listicles, and you can't even write an article anymore. It's got to be just the 10 reasons why Todd is smart when it comes to writing for busy readers. What was it?
Mitch, let's not make it 10. We'll never be able to populate that, and people will, and then it'll be embarrassing. Right. Sorry, the question is,
when did we start skimming? Is that a function of newspapers? Is it a function of just content being created in a different way?
So there's three kinds of reading. And it's not just academic. It's actually useful, and it will feel valid to you. The first is careful reading. It's the way we were taught to read in school. Word to word to word to word. There's also skimming, which is just going faster, still left to right, still top down. But we're just trying to, we're trying to get the gist sequentially in order. Then there's scanning, which is where you pop up and you're just trying to orient what is this about? And that's where headings are super useful. Maybe even the first sentence or the subject line or the title, but like you're scanning and you do all three when you're reading. You don't do just one. You scan, you're like, well, that's kind of interesting. I want to dive in. You read closely, like less interesting, start skimming. And so it's a combination of all of them. Those are the three. You asked when and how did it start? Well, in the 7th century, there were these Irish monks who were the first ones to insert spaces in printed letters. Right. And they called it aerating, which is just such a cool description of it. Right. They aerate the words because it is believed that up until the 15th century, this is going to bore your listeners, but like up until the 15th century, it is, there's a real debate about whether reading was ever done privately and silently. There was a belief that all reading was done in public to people, and that there was this revolution. They call it the silent reading revolution. It's not my field, but it was really fun to learn about. And it's pretty compelling. that there was this transition where we went from reading being a few people who read and they read to everybody to a lot of people can read, and written text is relatively inexpensive. And so we read silently, and that means much faster and much more of it. And then the aerating is super important, and the formatting super important, because you want to facilitate all of this. Is actually like, you could almost draw a line from this to what we're describing. Like, this is all to make it easier for silent readers to move fast. And what we're describing is, how do you write so you make it easier for your busy reader to just get through it before they give up on you? And so, like, almost like the rules that we're talking about is this like direct line from going from silent reading to like the managing your infinite queue before people give up on you.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who would even say that when you read some classic literature, the challenge is that a lot of it was read aloud, and that when you read it silently, it's that much more complex because it was never meant to be consumed that way.
I've never heard that, but exactly, that actually makes a ton of sense. I mean, it's kind of a crazy idea. Like, I have this historical sense that, we have this. I will start with me. Sometimes believe that the way things are is the way they've always been.
Right.
And like, it's absolutely 100% not the case for basically anything other than the essential features of what it means to be a person.
Yeah, it's a wild thing too. And if we think about real evolution in that, emojis have to play into this too now.
Yeah, emojis are fun. I don't know if you got into this in the book, but towards the end we talk about it. There are these surveys that are just so fun and make me so humbled that when you put a smiley face, I follow up after this and I text you. I'm like, Mitch, thanks for having me on the podcast. So fun, smiley face. You and I are roughly, I assume, the same-ish age. You might think the smiley face is like, hey, he means that was fun. My teenage daughter, who you met just before this podcast started, she would think I was being sarcastic. She'd be like, sure. Dad, was it terrible? Why would you send that to him unless it was you both agree it was horrible? And so the same emoji can get interpreted different ways. In a lot of ways, it just injects more ambiguity into our communication unless we're very certain that we know what our readers can interpret it as. So these going back to hieroglyphics are going to have the same problems probably hieroglyphics had.
Yeah, it's funny too, because I remember not long ago, going back several years, the idea of even boomer texting would be like when you put a period at the end of it. It's almost like saying to somebody it's over, versus somebody who's not a boomer would never do that type of thing. You start feeling really old real quick, Todd.
Yeah, I didn't even know that. And I still think I'm modeling. I feel even a heightened burden having written about how to write for busy people. I do add periods. Shoot, I'm going to look into this.
Yeah,
but actually, I think
I'll send you a link. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Make it a short email. But moving it up like a level, again, we haven't gotten into the specifics, but the TLDR version is if you add a round of editing where you ask yourself, how do I make this easier for the reader? And there are some principles for how you would do that they're more likely to read it, they're more likely to respond, and it's kinder. But moving up a level from this like question about emojis, we end up, one of the like critical things that is essentially human is your context and your audience. And there isn't an ironclad law on any communication, but your goal, your context, your audience. The context is background information. And so only you can set those. And like when we think about ChatGPT, it doesn't know any of those things right now. It may eventually learn some of the context. It may learn the norms, but you're writing for an audience. And if your audience knows you and I agree, smiley faces mean sincere, good, then we can do it. But like, context matters so much.
So do you think this is somewhat of a renaissance period for the written word, in the sense of people are experimenting more, they're using different types of writing words, acronyms, ways to say things, intonations? Do you feel that we are in a renaissance period for copy?
I never found data on this, but we looked for it on how many words do people write per person per day today versus other time periods. Because we do make this case, which I think is pretty sensible. We're all writers, everyone, whether you do it professionally as in you write something that other people read and you get paid for it, or you write to text to coordinate where we're going to meet this afternoon. Like, we write a lot. Everyone does. And so we set that up as, well, we've even seen that editing for ease of reading for your reader, even for text messages, makes it more likely people read and respond to your text messages.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if it's I don't have the evidence that we write more than we ever have, but it certainly seems plausible. And if I had to bet, I would say, yeah, we write more than we ever have. And in the process, it's kind of ironic that I think we might think we're in a post-writing-ish kind of age.
Yeah, this is the incredible paradox I'm constantly thinking about. I think about my childhood and how it was primarily spent in front of a television or playing non-interactive video games, meaning there wasn't anybody on the other side unless I was sitting next to somebody that I was playing. And we have this world now where even when you get into these big online games and you're a kid, there's a lot of reading required because of the chat and the books you find and things inside there. We see kids reading a lot. We've seen the success of books at a scale of which we hadn't seen for a while, I think. And yet we live in this world where we think, young people don't read anymore. They don't know how to write. They don't know how to write by hand. And there's all these strange things. And I look at general usage, and again, without any science or research behind it, it feels like people are reading and writing definitely more than they ever did, especially young people.
No, I agree. I think that's right. I mean, one, there is just a trend that every generation is more literate and more capable of reading, writing, and math, even though we always believe there's also a trend in people believing that things are worse now than they were in the past, though
Right.
Objectively that doesn't appear to be true. So yeah, I think that's right. But I do think, similar to early on, we were talking about, do we actually have less attention, and are we goldfish in this like attention span? And my answer was partly, well, it's cheaper to produce in terms of time and effort writing, and that means there's more of it. And it's also, on the consumer side, easier to switch and move on to the next thing. There's just more demand, and it's also a little less friction. In the same way, writing, it's easier for everybody to write now. So it makes a ton of sense. The barriers to me sending you a message is no longer, a postage stamp or even a phone call. It's some autofill thing on my phone where I say your name and it suggests that I was trying to tell you I was running late.
Yeah. There could be something in there as well. This idea that everybody can write, but it doesn't make everybody a writer. The idea that I mean it in more in the sense of, in a music analogy, I played bass for a while, then I became a music writer, then I have a podcast where I interview bass players, and people say to me, "Oh, are you a bass player?" And my answer is, I kind of know how to play bass, but I'm not a bass player. There is a certain level by which we have to delineate between those who are writing for practice and those who have elevated it to an art form. And some of those people use it as an art form in their text messaging and their posts on X.
That's interesting. I think writing has a third use case. There's the professional bass players. There's amateurs who do it for themselves and for the joy of it. And then in writing, there's professional, beautiful writers that write well and we consume it publicly. There's people who write for themselves, which is a form of writing that is different than this, because one of the things writing does is it clarifies our thinking.
Right.
But then there's the third, which is probably the most common that everyone does, which is some practical writing, which is I'm trying to do the magic of an idea from my head through some medium into your head. Like it is magical. Like if you pause for a second,
magic.
It is. I mean, it really is. Yeah. I've got this like incredibly weird thing in my head. I'm going to use words. I'm going to use these things across time and space. I'm going to get that idea into your head. And we do that all the time. And you're saying, well, maybe people don't identify with it. And maybe, I mean, that's something Jessica and I take a little while in the intro of, like, we are all writers, whether we think we are or not.
Right.
And so if as long as that is the case, as long as there are things that we care about that we are trying to convey to other people, either coordinative or informative, then we may as well work on being effective at it. And being effective is different than being good at writing, with quotes around it.
So when you talk about effective, let's dig into this a little bit. The thing that I try to communicate to people who ask me about my writing and my work is I am constantly thinking about not just what I'm trying to say, but how that person is going to receive it and understand it. And that actually physically includes where are they and what time is it?
Okay.
Meaning, I could send a text to you knowing full well that you're neck deep in hanging out with your teenage daughter at that time, and I'm getting it off of my plate, but not necessarily recognizing where you might be in your moment in time just because I'm doing it. It might also mean that I send you something somewhat sarcastically and you're just in a pissy mood and you can't see the sarcasm in that moment, and it not only misses you but creates a complete rift. It could be me informing you of something without adding any context to it, and you thinking that it's an attack versus me being a friend. We see this all the time in communications, by the way.
Yeah. And so what are you wondering? It's this idea of thinking about the context of the person.
Yeah. I'm wondering about how much you feel the power of the message isn't just how I create it and send it, but understanding the actual capacity of the person in that moment in time at the other side.
I like that. Yeah. I and Jessica and I spend a lot of time underscoring how there aren't ironclad laws because we all differ in our context, and that context includes who we are and how people read us. That said, there are commonalities, which is everyone's skimming, everyone's scanning, everyone's trying to move on as quickly as possible. And so that's where the principles derive from. But you're saying, well, there's also within person trying to take the perspective of your reader and understand that the moment and situation they're in. Like I have an axe to grind with you. I know you're in it right now. So I'm going to future send it. You're going to get it in 2 weeks instead of right now. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we're not awesome at that.
No, we're terrible at it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the opposite.
We're not awesome at that. But I mean, it's all part of context. Understanding your reader's expectations in their context. When you said the sarcasm thing, it reminded me of a hilarious study that I think will resonate for everyone, which is they brought these people in and they told them to write something sarcastic. And then they said, what % of readers do you think will understand that you're being sarcastic? And they're like, 90+% or whatever, everybody, because it's obvious to me, having written this, that it's sarcastic. And then they have a different group of people randomly assigned to read it. And it invariably is like less than chance. It's about chance, no better than chance that they have any idea that it's like you're like sarcastic or not. And they're 50-50. And what I love about that is like, it's so clear I'm being sarcastic when I wrote it. And we just fail so badly at taking other people's perspective. And so the takeaway can't be no humor, no sarcasm. It can be, but that would be a dull gray writing scape. But one takeaway is that and it's like with my kids, they say I over-explain a joke, is that you got to kind of assume they're not going to get you're kidding, in parentheses JK, even though it really does suck the joy out of some of it. But it protects against the really costly miscommunications and misunderstandings that especially sarcasm can lead to.
But this idea of it being costly is really true. We see this just in the world of social media, where somebody will post a parody of something, a news item, and it's taken almost at that same level of sarcasm at a 50%. And you follow the comments, and we even have a saying for this, by the way, online. We say the comments, as if we all know the ridiculousness that's happening in the comments, that people didn't recognize it as parody. They didn't see it as such. They took it, again, how they're reading it in that moment in time and just how raged they are. there is something interesting there about the result of skimming, scanning versus taking that beat. There is something there. It can't just be blamed on the copy. There is another person involved in this, which is the receiver of the information.
And you're saying that the receiver, well, in some cases, the receiver is motivated to not.
But trained in the world of skimming and scanning, you're not then going to take that beat to recognize or acknowledge potentially the real intent of it, right? And so you can say, well, we shouldn't write for that, but I feel that's kind of dismissive of what makes things interesting in terms of content in the world.
We often talk about, we as in my colleagues and I often, when we start having discussions, have to make this distinction between what we call descriptive and normative, which is like, are we describing the world as it is, or are we saying how it should be? Both are worthy and important things to do well. But if we conflate them, then all of a sudden we're yelling at clouds. Like the world is like people read as they read. And our goal is to help people writers be more effective writing to their readers and that means writing in a way that accommodates and reflects the reality that they're not reading it closely, and that all of it, and that their goal is to move on. That they can read closely if they're interested, and there's often this tension between adding more and deterring people from reading altogether. And so that's one dimension. I just don't want to overly focus on less is more. It's one of the 6 principles, but it's one that people really struggle with. I was talking to a journalist friend last week, and she was saying that as an editor, she would her most common feedback was always cut it, cut it, cut it. And she was getting close to saying, if you can't convey the thing you're talking about in 200 words, then you probably don't understand it. And I like, that's a pretty radical take. Let me make it even like, if you're writing something and you can't summarize it concisely, let's make it 2 or 3 sentences. It's possible then that you don't understand it well enough to know why it matters. Cause that's what a summary is. It's like, what's the essence of it? What's the gist? And of course, like when you're in the weeds, it's hard to do that. But like some writers confuse content with judgment, right? Like it really requires judgment deciding what's in and what's out. And judgment is basically what's the goal.
There's always this conversation too about the more restrictions you put on something. Some would argue that makes you more creative. Others would argue it creates more constrictions that make it more difficult to do this. I submit that you're putting out this idea that these restrictions allow for more creativity. They allow you to explore things in different ways.
I haven't thought about that. I don't know. I don't have a take on that. What I am saying is you're just more likely to be effective if you impose those constraints on yourself. I teach at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And so I have executive education all the time of like government leaders from around the world. I mean, not the president, but administrative arms. And I was astonished while teaching when someone who was the assistant secretary in a country other than the US said, I just had this experience a couple weeks ago where there was a crisis in our country. The president asked for something. I was asked to write a brief summary of it. I wrote 10 pages because there's a lot of background to understand. And the chief of staff was like, there is 0 chance the president is going to read your 10 pages. Turn it into 200 words. And I asked the class, it's like, have you ever experienced this? And I could not believe every single person laughingly raised their hands of having had this experience. I just didn't know how prevalent it was, that the feedback we give is like, it's just you got to make it easier for the reader. The reader wants this is useful. This
is something so strange, because being Canadian, as somebody who's interested in the US and politics, I am very illuminated by something that I'm sure all of my listeners are thinking about right now, which is Donald Trump was persistently made fun of because he wanted these one-pagers, couple of bullet points. And what we're saying is actually it's exactly how people want it. He was literally made fun of for weeks and then maybe months on end because he was accused of not reading them and he just wanted a one-pager and an overview. And everyone thought, well, you got to dig in. You should know your things. Even currently in your Senate or House of Commons up here, we have the same problem, which is these laws are passed that are thousands and thousands of pages. We know no one's read them. No one's looked at them. They stuff them with other things to try and get them through. So what you're saying will obviously be a head shake of like, of course, Todd, that makes perfect sense. But the reality of it is we will be critical and criticize those that then do this.
I think that the criticisms in some of the examples you were talking about are, informed by other considerations. But I mean, like Obama, who was considered kind of an intellectual of the president, also had one-page presidential daily briefs.
So did Jeff Bezos. He pushed them for all of his meetings, right?
Yeah,
the one-pager, and then we'll talk about it. But then we make fun of other people for doing the exact same thing. There's an irony there.
Sure. If we think that the making fun of the person is in good faith about that topic, yes, sure. I mean, the Trump story is complicated by, lots of other stories about, the way he would respond to information.
But even laws, like we do see laws that you're asking these people to pass that are unreasonable in their length and detail.
Yes.
They're done in a way to obscure or hide certain things. We tend to live in a world beyond choosing a political side that is driven by that. Think about contracts. How many times have you seen a contract for a very simple activity that is 4 pages of liabilities and IP and disclaimers and clauses that have no, even if you were a lawyer, you'd read this and think this is a bit onerous.
Yes. I love this New Yorker cartoon where it's like clearly in hell and it's the devil, Satan, talking to one of his underlings. And he says, the language in this contract is wordy and indirect and uses unnecessary technical words and phrases. I am very pleased. I think the motive is that you're attributing to the writers of these things, I think is interesting. And often the case. I think that when someone writes something to you in a way that is unnecessarily complex, it either signals that they don't understand the concept well enough, or they are in fact trying to trick you.
Can I add a layer to that, though?
Yeah.
That I think might be more prevalent. I think the layer that I would add to that is it's because they think that that is what somebody who has their level and skill is supposed to do to deliver the message. That if you speak simply, you won't be seen as intelligent. That if you keep it short and tight, that it will seem like you actually don't know information. That people overcompensate 99.9% of the time simply because it's what they assume to be the persona of what they're trying to project.
Could be 99.98% or whatever number you gave. That seems I'm going to take the under on that. But it can't be universally true what I'm about to describe, but there is a very cool study where they show that among college students, if you read someone who has written using completely unnecessary verbiage to describe something, that you think they are less intelligent than in another condition where they have the exact same thing without the like complex synonyms. And because you can tell it's like completely unnecessary. That paper won this funny award that they give out called the Ig Nobel. That it was just for like hilarious, ridiculous things humans do that are very illuminating. So it could, I don't think that's universally true. I think that you're right. Sometimes people are trying to signal things, and it's not a mistake in all cases, right? You need to know your context, and nobody cares about the inner workings of academic scholarship, but we have to write these reviews where we're like, well, I'll submit a paper to you and you'll write a review of it where you'll say, Todd, this is hardly even legible. I don't think it's novel. I think it's the worst thing ever. And here are 12 objections I have. and I'll show it to my family and I'll say, this is a pretty good review. I think they liked it. I think it's going to get in. And so, but then I have to go case by case and respond. And if I have a 4-word response for each of their 12 things, they're not going to think that I gave it consideration. So I need to say more there. But, and this is, again, everybody has their own context, but in our context, you want to show them respect by matching the complexity and the depth and honestly the wordiness of their review. But if you do want them to understand your response, you want the sentences to be simple and straightforward. You want to use formatting to reinforce the main message. You want to quote the changes you're making. If you want them to understand, I have colleagues who have laughed about using devilish language that is kind of inscrutable and buried in technical long sentences so that they appear to be responding, but they know it's kind of going to be that the reviewer is going to be like everyone else and just skim it. And so depends on what your goal is. And Jessica and I badly want to be always on the side of, we want to write clearly so that our ideas are understood and that is kinder for your reader and more effective for you. There are edge cases where you're going to be trying to not be read, but I think we'd like to not be on that side. We think you should write so that it is easy for your reader to read.
So what is your thesis on the thesis then?
I like that wording of the question. For your listeners, the thesis, I presume, is when someone is finishing a PhD, they write a doctoral thesis. And it is typically incredibly the word that one of our principles is use simple, common words, but I'm going to use an uncommon word called esoteric, which is just basically like obscure and unfamiliar for anyone but an expert. I think those are common in theses, I guess. And I think that, again, like they have to, the writer has their goal and the writer has an audience, and the audience is the people who are going to decide whether the thesis is sufficient to grant a PhD. And so if that's the case, they need to write according to what the audience expects. I've worked with people who work in intelligence in militaries, and they write intelligence assessments on a topic, and they have to be a certain length. The norm is a certain length, and they're like, it can't be less because it'll look like you didn't do your job. And so, okay, that's fine. If the goal is to be read and to be understood, if there's an action item, you need to be very clear at the very beginning. If you want people to navigate it, you want to add structure and headings. If you want to make it easy to read, you want to make sure you don't use unnecessary jargon. You want to use short common words and short sentences. That said, you can't make it shorter, right? Because you have that constraint. I think a thesis looks like that. It's got to look like a thesis. We wrote a book where one of the principles is write less. And the irony is not lost on us. We wrote a 250-page book about the science of how you write for busy people, and one of the 6 principles is write less. But a book has to look like a book. People pick up a book and they expect it to have detail and be flowing and not be bullet points and not be a one-pager. But if you want the one-pager, Mitch, I will send it to you. Put it in the show notes, please. There's a one-pager. It's the TLDR version of the 6 principles. But if you want to, more depth, a book's got to look like a book, and our book looks like a book.
Talk to me a little bit about swearing. And I mean swearing in how we create writing for busy readers, impactful words. In advertising, we talk about edge emotions. You don't want them to giggle. You want them to laugh. You don't want them to get emotional. You want them to cry or feel something more deep or something that resonates more. Swearing, many people would say never, 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 especially in writing, but we're seeing it be much more common. We're seeing people use it in much more common ways. Have you thought about that as a context for writing for busy readers? It sure is a great way to get attention or make a point.
First, I will answer that. But what is an edge emotion? That's a cool idea.
So an edge emotion would be, you don't want people to feel like heartwarmed about something. You want to push it to the edge where they will cry. You don't want it to be a nice snicker. You want them to really guffaw, something that's going to push them to an emotional point that they're going to want to remember it and then share it immediately. So that that's why most advertising fails. It doesn't cross that line into a place where it actually pulls at your heart in one way or another.
That's interesting. Huh. I think that part of the story you're telling there about advertising and edge emotions is the same that curse words might have, is the same that some other writing hacks might have, which is everything is about navigating a world where people are not paying attention. Writing for busy readers is to make it easier for those who are already going to give you some attention to pull out the key information and decide what they want to dive more into and get the key information. I guess one function of a swear word or one function of just a surprising thing is that it may capture a little bit more attention and may draw in people to give you a little bit more of their time. But I think that that's true of a lot of different kind of tactics. So in 2008, Obama, who at the time pioneered small dollar online fundraising, built this whole campaign with lots of money from small donors and emails. I don't know if you remember or followed this. What was the most popular or the most effective subject line of any fundraising email during that campaign? It was like widely written about when we're now talking 15 years ago.
Yeah, I wouldn't remember, but it rings a bell, this idea. Me seeing these articles ring a bell.
Yeah, so it was lowercase HEY. That was the subject line.
Right. Hey. Yeah.
And the reason, the story becomes straightforward in a second. The reason is because nobody wrote to you with a subject line like that, except for someone who had a personal relationship. So you opened it. And stage one is capturing attention long enough to deliver your message. And so it got open. But then eventually, as you would expect, everyone migrated to personal subject lines that looked familiar, and they stopped being effective because they were no longer uncommon. They were common. And so it didn't capture as much attention. And so it wasn't that that's some iron law of how we should write subject lines or communicate with people. It's just, does it stand out and is it unusual? I would imagine if everybody started, writing curse words in their subject lines, at first it would capture attention, and then eventually it wouldn't capture more attention than a typical message. So yeah, I think it's all about managing attention.
Yeah, it rings very true. Think about Mark Manson's book, and that led to all these business books having an F word in it or a swear word in it. And now, not that that's going away, you still see them, but that created its own category of doing something where everybody thought they needed a swear word in the title of their nonfiction business book.
Yeah, we thought about writing for effing busy writers, but we're like that niche has already been filled.
Yeah, I'm sure
we
the
did not.
That was pushed for it.
Parentheses JK. Parentheses JK.
So one of the easiest things I've discovered when I'm going through people who are asking me to criticize or review their work is just simply the overuse of adjectives. You see this a lot, by the way, when musicians write their own biography. Just these going on and on, just a million adjectives per sentence. Are there certain tropes like that where clearly you could cut out a ton of adjectives here to get the same message across? It seems like an easy, low-hanging fruit one.
I think what you're saying is, are there common phrases that are easy to replace? Although I think you're asking a more interesting question than that, but I will answer the question the easier one.
You want to answer?
Yeah. In the book, we list a whole set of these. The reason for this can be replaced with because, or, whole set of phrases like that, where they're not adjectives so much as just like common phrases we write that can easily be condensed to make it faster and easier for readers to read. And then on our website, we have a list of, I don't know what the number is, 1,500 phrase pairs, where it's like, replace this with that, where you get probably 95% overlap in meaning, and you can decide if it actually serves your purpose. But our goal is effective communication for busy readers to make it as easy for them as possible. Not all writing is willing to sacrifice the precision and even art of some of these words for this effectiveness goal that we have.
How connected is this work with writing with persuasion? Can we blur it? One example that I always think of is I was told it many years ago. It works in written, it works in verbal. When you're wanting to ask somebody to do something that is definitely in your favor, you start with will you. So, for example, if you're going to ask somebody in the lobby for a late checkout, it's not, can I please have a late checkout? It's, will you give me a late check? And that tends to always, for some reason, be something in our brains that makes it easier for the person to say yes to. Can you talk a little bit about phrases, persuasion, and how closely related they are to being an effective writer?
That's really funny. I've never heard that.
Oh, it's a
Will
good one.
you? It has
Try
a
it.
little bit of the feel of Ellen Langer ran these studies in the 70s where people need to make photocopies and there's a line in front of the photocopy machine. And in one condition, they're like, can I please cut in line? And the other condition, it's, can I cut in line because I need to make photocopies? And it's a line at the photo. Everybody needs to make photocopies. And when you add because, they're like, oh, I guess, sure. Yeah, you have a reason.
Will you let me make my copies first? There you go. It's going to work. See, right away you're nodding, Todd. You're like, yes, I will.
Yeah, sure. Would you like me to make them for you, and I'll deliver them to you?
It's
the way. So when I hear influence and persuasion, I think of mentor and co-author of Jessica and mine, Bob Cialdini, who we've written with about how to break through with attention and be persuasive. I actually think of this as like the stage that precedes all of persuasion, which is like we started this conversation with, well, I was working in voting, I was working in fundraising, I was working in energy use, I was working in getting kids to go to school. All of it is communicating with busy people. And then once you have their attention, then it's, what are you saying? And stage one of everything is how do we get our message through in a world where they're skimming and they're busy? And so I actually think that it's literally, I don't know if it's literally complementary, but they're at least additive in that you can write a 17 paragraph, incredibly persuasive narrative that would just in the end have an edge emotion triggered and compliance. But the odds are extremely low anyone is going to get to the end of that. Yeah. And so we're thinking about, I think we're a stage right in front of it.
But hey is a great example of that, where you might feel the persuasion of that because it's that jarring thing that when someone says that to me, you do pay attention.
Yeah. I think that's right.
I'm curious about generative AI. We talked a little bit about ChatGPT. Can you walk me through a little bit about how this changes? So I would think of the iteration from text and writing by hand to typewriters to grammar to having to deal with all these technology, then Grammarly, and now suddenly we're in this world of ChatGPT.
Yeah, we think a lot about this. It was funny. A friend has joked that we may have written the last book about writing.
Because the next one won't be written by a human, right?
Well, or that also that no one needs to know how to write. I don't buy either of it. But so ChatGPT is incredible in that it's trained to write as we write. And you could think of it, the large language model process, as inductive in that it builds from looking at what we've done. It doesn't know how to write for busy readers because it's never really been organized. What are the principles of how we write for busy readers? It can and will.
Once it reads your book, it can.
Exactly. So like on our website, and I'll share this with you too. I think you'll like this, Mitch, given your interest. We actually, with the computer scientists here, we tuned GPT-4 to the principles, and then also with pre and post examples of how they were applied. In this case, we trained it for email, but it can be trained for anything. But in this case, so we have a Chrome extension and a website that does this, where you just paste an email and it rewrites it according to the principles. And I love it as a coaching tool, like a 24/7, like just, yeah. I think
like
you only
Grammarly.
Yeah. Except that, except that, again, Grammarly isn't trained on how you get people to respond. It's trained on how to write better. It could be trained on how, and it will be eventually. And so what I love about it is it really, even I learn, I hadn't thought that this paragraph could be turned into a bulleted list of elements of this idea and be easier to skim. One thing just about bullets before we just sort of like, bullets are not easier to read. They just are visually easier to look over. And so one of the like heuristics or like shortcuts that Jessica and I put out that I think you'll see, and this is the way that the AI writes when we trained it, is that any bullet with more than like 10 or 15 words, you have a little title on it, on what it is, so that people can skim. So that like it's basically, so they don't have to read it. They can see, oh, this is about logistics. Don't care. This is about cost. Don't care. This is about marketing. I do care about that. And then you read the bullet. And so like the little things like that just make it easier for your reader to be able to know what to skip and what to dive into. So
my general frustration when I read books like this is I don't understand why it comes to this point where Todd and Jessica have to write these books. Why are we not teaching this at school at a young age? Why do we consistently go down this path where we're ultimately teaching people to do things that in a way in which nobody wants to consume?
oh my God, we talk a lot, and we've sort of been coached out of talking about your high school English teacher or your high school language teacher. But we are taught to write in almost like some kind of idealized form.
Yeah.
That exactly like you're saying, that isn't really how anyone will ever write again. I mean, I don't mean humans. I mean, like most people will never write a 7-paragraph essay after they're done with schooling, which is fine, but they will write messages and pitches and whatever else. So we're trying, and I'm asking you, Mitch, and all your listeners, you're all on the team. Our goal is to make it to help to have writers insert in the editing process one round where they ask themselves, how would I make this easier for the reader? That's the goal. And we're trying to talk with high school English curriculums, college writing curriculums. We're trying to move on to get this to be just part of how we teach to write. And it's just, how do I make it easier for the reader? It turns out that's more effective. It's also kinder.
Tell me the one thing that made you think differently or changed your mind.
Not about writing right now. Now we're just pivoting.
Great.
Okay. I was recently talking with 2 friends, and I observed one of them. One of them was having a hard time. And the other one said to them, geez, it seems like this is a really hard situation. You're doing awesome given how hard it is. And it was just like a acknowledgement of, you're doing great. And this person was really struggling, but was doing great in context. And the person just started sobbing. And it just, what I like, it made me realize that most people, all of us, like most people don't hear that they're doing a good job, that even when it's hard, they're doing a good job. And they almost, especially when it's hard, they don't hear that. And it has changed the way I talk with people. It was just really like incredible to witness. Just as simple as just like, I see you and hey, I think you're doing great. And it's hard.
That might be one of the best answers I've had to this question, which is great. Todd, that's amazing. The new book is called Writing for Busy Readers. Let people know where they can find out more about the book, follow you, follow Jessica. Let us know.
Great. Thanks. We have a website creatively called writingforbusyreaders.com. And on it, you can get the book. You can find the AI tool that will show you what a rewritten email looks like. You can find lots of other resources. And if this is my sign off, we should add a round of editing to everything we write, where we ask ourselves, how do I make it easier for the reader? Because when we do that, it's more effective and it's kinder.
That's great. Todd, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Mitch. This has been fun.